there are two talks coming up from the grand duo of myself and Roy Taylor. They will have very different styles, and you're going to have to keep very awake, and they're going to go very fast for the first one. Roy will then do the calm, beautiful thing in a few minutes' time. That is a mountain of notes, which we'll come back to if we get there. I have disclosures, which are here, and very important acknowledgements to the co-authors of our paper, which is not in the book that was circulated for you, but is on the website and everywhere else. To Sue Roberts at Tufts and Arne Astrup, and their contributions will pop up as we go through what I have to say. Firstly, everybody here is wanting to try and tell me the answers to my talk before I get here, and you'll probably continue to do it in the subsequent talks. What is obesity? It is not a BMI of 30. Forget that. It is a disease process, and it's a disease process that we have to tackle with many consequences. Who's got it? Well, if you look at the BMI over 30, I just wanted to point out a couple of things here. One is huge differences between countries, and this is using Eurostat data, and also a very marked progression throughout adult life. In Scotland, we become adult age 16, and at that age, approximately 3% of people have a BMI over 30. So most of the obesity we have in the population happens after becoming adult, and it gets up to pretty high proportions. Varies a lot between the countries. What I have to consider here is, firstly, prevention and treatment, and to guide individuals as well as populations. We have to consider foods and how they group and become meals. And I think the unit of nutrition is the meal. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to talk about health or the contribution of specific foods, except in the context of the overall diet and the meals that make it up. We are interested in energy balance and how the fat mass changes. We're then interested in secondary consequences, metabolic and also physical ones, some of which are also affected by food in a variety of ways. Ultimately, does the advice that we might come up with apply to everybody equally, or are there some people who might actually be disadvantaged? And that is a common theme throughout this meeting. The guidelines on obesity started off in 1996. There was no guideline, clinical guideline, until the SIGN guideline in 1996, and it came up with four elements. Firstly, we need to consider prevention of weight gain. Secondly, weight loss for those who need it. Thirdly, preventing regain, which may or may not be the same as primary prevention. And fourthly, most importantly, improving health for people, whether or not they can lose weight. There are some basics that we have to sort of start with. And there is an absolute truth, and Darius has poured scorn on this and told me that, that this is a fatally flawed assertion. It is an absolute truth that energy stores equal energy intake over energy expenditure, but those two factors are not fixed. They are mobile. You cannot escape that particular truth. And we knew that obesity can only develop, and it most certainly will develop, if that organism consumes an excess number of calories above what it's expending. There is no escaping that absolute truth. We also know, and this is something which the general public often get wrong, these are data from Frank Hitton, no they're not, they're Harrison Benedict, 1919, so it's been around a long time, that metabolic rate increases with body weight. And that's an obvious and fundamental thing, but many people do get it wrong still. More complicated, of course, it increases with body weight, but it also ranks by families. So there are factors here which may be genetic or heritable, but are probably not genetic, as we'll come on to. But families do have similar patterns. And there is a range of relative metabolic rate for your size, which may predict how much you're inclined, because of your individual metabolism, to gain weight under circumstances or to lose it better under others. We also know, and it's sort of old hat stuff, but again, keeps getting forgotten, and people like Jeff Hall keep reminding us that we'd forgotten it, that your metabolic rate will vary with your weight. So this is a famous study by Rudy Leibel, which showed that if people gained weight by 10%, their metabolic rates went up. 24-hour energy expenditure went up. They needed more calories to stay there at that higher weight. They returned to their original weight, and everything went back to normal. They lost weight, and their metabolic rates are then suppressed. So you have to eat fewer calories to stay at that lower body weight. And this is perhaps where I think Darius is probably pointing to the complexity within the energy balance equation. Interesting also to observe that with 20% loss, there's no further adaptation in metabolic rate below the 10% loss. Those are in the gray. I mentioned that the genetic factors are pretty minor here. There's been countless billions of dollars thrown at genetic research for obesity and type 2 diabetes. They've come up with very little to explain any of it. There are masses of genes related, associated, but their effect sizes are minuscule. Added to which, the epidemic of obesity has happened over 2 generations. Our genes simply haven't changed in that way. Likewise, the secondary epidemic of type 2 diabetes, our genes are not responsible for this, although epigenetics may be playing a part. Per capita food supplies have increased. There's no escaping that. That is not to say that is the cause of obesity, but it's there and it cannot be denied. And there are many reasons why people are eating more food, or if they are eating more food, the main one being that they're getting bigger. And the important issue here, which we must address at some point, there have been extraordinary changes in what we see around us in our food supply. When I was a schoolboy, I would have been punished if I had been eating between meals. And that probably applies to other people of roughly my age, which is enormous, as you can probably tell. That's happened within, 2 generations, shall we say. Now, every school child is sent to school with a snack to eat between meals, and it's often wrapped up in coloured paper, and it has lots and lots of calories. And social marketing is very powerful, and it's been very effective. I'm not saying it's the cause, but it's hard to ignore it. And physical activity has pretty much disappeared. There's the global food supply. Up it goes, up about 400 or odd calories over a lifetime, or a short lifetime. And interesting, the land required to make it has tailed off. Important to note that this applies to just about all aspects of our food supply. And I've shown on the left here a sort of ground picture which shows, and the eagle eyes will say, oh, look, the black flour and cereals have gone up more, haven't they, than the fats and oils. So perhaps that tells us something. But remember, this is pounds weight per capita. And you have to then look and think, hang on, these nutrients aren't all exactly the same, are they? Our students, and hello, there's one at the back there, can recall that all fats have 9 calories per gram, alcohol 7, proteins 4, digestible carbohydrates 3.75, and then you're down to the soluble dietary, the fermentable dietary fiber of 2. And the story doesn't stop there, so Darius, we're still on target here, because all of these nutrients have different effects on your metabolism. And here are some figures which were collected up by Klaus Westerterp very usefully, which shows that fat, which gives you the most calories, produces the least diet-induced thermogenesis. And the other figures you can see there, 10 to 30% for alcohol, 20 to 30% for proteins, 5 to 10 for carbohydrates. This is getting complicated, isn't it? And then we have effects of these nutrients, apparently, on what people eat, which delves into psychology here. And this is a picture from a study of James Stubbs, now, 20 years ago, which showed that if you give people food with exactly the same weight, they can't tell what's in it, but 3 different diets with high fat, low fat, and a medium fat, that they automatically select foods. This is ad libitum feeding. They go for the food which, when they're on the high-fat diet, they then begin to accumulate extra calories. This is a short-term study, but it reflects what we seem to see in the population. In our paper, there's a large section which is fascinating on the willpower-centric system, which has been alluded to earlier. You can read, I'm not going to go through that, but I will point out to this note at the bottom that government funding for obesity treatment is way below what we pay for treating other diseases for comparable deaths and disabilities. Physical activity has been overemphasized in most of our guidelines, particularly when industry becomes involved, sponsoring sporting events and such like. And I've just pointed out here two things. One is that on the right-hand side, the study from one of my former students, that taking a short exercise, walking for 20 minutes, suppresses appetite acutely in inactive people. And this is probably reflecting Jean Mayer's old concept, which came from his animal studies, and this is, in fact, a study from the mill workers in India, I think, which showed that there is a regulated zone of appetite with a certain level of physical activity when people then eat enough to pay back what they're expending, and that applies to, Tour de France cyclists, right down to a low level, below which, and that's the inflection point there, below the green zone, when body weights go up and appetite goes up. The couch potato actually exists, and Jean Mayer showed this in 1956. So that story still exists, and we're probably, most of us, well below that inflection point at the present time. So a little bit of exercise will probably reduce your appetite. Are there special effects on obesity from particular foods? And there's a lot of noise out there, either as causes, and there are some I've listed here, sugar, refined grains, or as protective, and there we think of the ones which are dairy foods. They've been mentioned in the earlier talks, yogurt, cheese, nuts. And To some extent, I think the evidence is, it doesn't show specific effects of these foods, but they are markers of a dietary pattern and indeed a lifestyle pattern which is associated with and which is driving obesity. And we'll come back to some points of that. And I think this has again also been mentioned, thank you for somebody, that the word healthy has a connotation of health. It cannot be applied to foods. It doesn't have any meaning when you apply it to foods. And we actually have a very interesting paper which you can look up. It's not cited in our paper, Buckton, 2015. And there's this massive confusion between what we're recommending for health, fitness, and those are different, and for weight management. Cravings are interesting. They definitely happen. There's no question about this. And certain people have cravings for foods at different times, pregnancy being a good example. But there is really no evidence that they fall into the same category as addictive chemicals. However, foods can invoke the same pathways in the brain. And to summarize this, there is an addictive pathways in the brain which are part of normal. We are addicted to breathing, drinking, eating. We don't stop even when we're not hungry. We're addicted to reproduction as well, oddly enough. And these processes in the brain are linked. And they can be overcome, or we can fall into them. And when physiological addictions to eating can be corrupted in certain ways, and I put at the bottom here, adding caffeine, which has no flavor in the amounts which it's added to our drinks, has no flavor at all, is addictive, and I don't know the evidence on this. I know Boyd Swinburne did a study some years showing that increased consumption of sweetened drinks. So there are two brain areas involved in eating. One is the hypothalamus, which deals with hunger, and the other at the top there, the mesolimbic system, which is to do with rewards and motivation and reinforcement and attractiveness of foods. And the truth is that the mesolimbic system can overcome hunger. So we can be eating when we're not hungry, and that's a common phenomenon. If you're interested in further reading on this, a fascinating paper here, Neuroscience and Behavioral Reviews, which explores this in detail and concludes that addictions apply to eating, not to specific foods. And I shan't go into that in further detail. This example of sugar is hugely important. It'll be discussed again and again. Sugar provides 3.75 calories, so relatively low, and it has a low glycemic index. But it's not essential. On the other hand, it aids palatability, as Jenny pointed out rather nicely. And its consumption has risen, as I've shown, in conjunction with the snack foods and the rise in obesity globally. The meta-analysis which Lisa Timaranga did, I think, is still outstanding because it looked at this in such a logical way. In children, there is no doubt that consuming more sugar-sweetened beverages, and I pointed out the slight typo in that paper there, is associated with a greater incidence of obesity. So there's no question that sugar-sweetened beverage consumption doesn't say it's the cause, but it's associated and probably related to the cause. Otherwise, the effects in adults, from a meta-analysis here, less than 1 kilogram effect from increasing free sugars on measures of body fatness. And Lisa went on to look at evidence of bias and found that if you do a funnel plot, you will find that the studies with the apparently bigger effects are those with the smaller sample sizes, and those with the big sample sizes have smaller effects. So it throws some doubt on some of this. A tiny effect and some doubt about the methodology. When the isocaloric diets were examined, there was no difference at all. So this tells us that, yes, if sugar is driving a little bit of weight gain, or sugar-sweetened beverages, it's not to do with the sugar itself, because if you replace that with another nutrient, there's no effect at all. So it's part of a diet pattern which is causing obesity. And that was her conclusion in the paper. So the free intake of free sugars or sugar-sweetened beverages do determine body weight, but the change in body fatness with modifying increase tells us that it is not an inherent property of the sugar or the sugar-sweetened beverages. It's to do with a pattern of eating. There's a slight sideline here. Many talks already, and there'll be more, are looking at effects of changing diet and their impact on body weight, or on secondary outcomes like diabetes. This is a study on looking at the outcome in diabetes, and I'm aware that Roy is going to go here. And it shows that if you adjust for adiposity, this is Imamura, big study, if you adjust for adiposity, you get a very small, a 5% reduction in the apparent association between sugar-sweetened beverages and diabetes. But it's still there. So the conclusion, it still exists. That's adjusting for adiposity, or is it? It's actually not. It's adjusting for body mass index, which has a correlation with body fat of about 0.8, explained variance about 0.6 something. So there's a lot of unexplained variance there from the sugar. And here's another study which did the same sort of thing with a slightly bigger apparent reduction once you adjust for body mass index. Now, one of my students has very recently done a very nice study going back to look at doing a systematic review of these, and which shows that if you go back and look at the very big Scottish Health Survey here, if you adjust for body mass index, you reduce that association between sugar-sweetened beverages and diabetes, but it's still there. Adjust for waist circumference, a bit more of that reduction is, and it shows here the p-value. The p-value increasing, and the black bar is the reduction in odds ratio. So, and if you go on then to look at total adipose tissue mass using a validated equation, you can eliminate some more of that association. If you go as far as to use body fat percent using published validated equations, you can then pretty much eliminate the association between sugar-sweetened beverages and diabetes. So don't rely on body mass index in any of these studies. It just doesn't do the job. Should you be reducing carbohydrate or fat? And the summary here is that the RCTs tell us that there is minimal or no overall difference in the long-term effects of body weight between the high and low carbohydrate diets. And there is an argument which says some of the small differences in some of the studies appear to favor the lower glycemic load or low carbohydrate, and I don't think they're quite the same. And here's the equation again, the absolute truth. Under metabolic ward conditions, the famous study of Walter Bort's, N equals 1, where he switched carbohydrate and fat during a calorie-restricted diet for weight loss in a very, very obese patient, absolutely no effect which one was using. So the calorie deficit caused the weight loss irrespective of which source it had. Meta-analyses conclude time and time again that there is no significant or no major effect between reducing carbohydrate or reducing fat. Here's one, and here's another. In that particular study, a lot of outcomes were included with both non-diabetic and diabetic individuals. None of these were significantly different: weight loss, body mass index, blood pressure, lipids, etc. But they mattered more for people with diabetes. So the benefits of losing weight, whatever way you did it, was greater for people with diabetes. And of course, the study from, I can never say Go and Hall, which was published more recently, which looked at controlled feeding experiments, again showing no effect, if anything favoring in that particular one the lower fat, higher carbohydrate diets on their effects on body fat in these controlled feeding experiments. So if there is any effect here, it is very tiny. And another student has just conducted a paper which is in Obesity Reviews, who looked at the sources of bias and errors in the meta-analysis. And what he did was a meta-analysis of the meta-analyses here, of all the meta-analyses which have looked at low versus high carbohydrate diets, and related that to their 3-year citations, their AmStar quality, and the differences in weight loss. And you can see here that just as a very broad thing, it looks like the best quality studies have the smallest differences in weight change here, whereas those with, this is a very big pointer, which way is it going? Anyway, the top right-hand panel suggests that poorer quality studies have bigger weight losses, and you can see that the citations also relate this. So the biggest difference in weight gets you the more citations, but the poorest quality gets you the biggest citations. So there's a little bit of study for you to ponder over. The one small point here which has been forgotten. When I was a medical student, I was taught that glycogen is stored in your liver and your muscle together with water. And that's really important, because if you're going running, as I do, and climb mountains, I need glycogen for that bit of energy, and I also need water, and they're released together. Isn't that fascinating? Physiology is wonderful. And the calculations tell us that each gram of glycogen is stored with approximately 3 or 4 grams of water. So your total body glycogen will store about 2 kilograms of water. So if you really do go on a low carbohydrate diet and deplete your body glycogen, you won't be able to run up the hill so fast. You will also have a 2 kilogram difference in weight purely because of that sort of fake effect. I learnt that at medical school, but it's been widely forgotten. How about no carbohydrate? And we've heard that somebody, apparently, I think Fiona told us, somebody said that somebody's actually done this. Well, here's a patient who turned up in our accident department at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and I happened to walk through and see him, and I was able to stop the MRI scans and the surgeons going at him because I said, hang on, this man has lost a lot of weight. And he had. He lost 30 kilograms on a total carbohydrate exclusion diet, very ill-advised. He had beriberi, his heart had doubled in size, ECG wildly abnormal. He needs his carbohydrate, at least some, to give him the thiamine. And there's the benefit of carbohydrate for the bowel has already been mentioned. Within type 2 diabetes, weight loss is hugely important, and the treatment effects here are shown in a meta-analysis which is not yet fully published but was presented. It's been conducted for the EASD Diabetes Nutrition Study Group by Anne-Marie Aas, and what it showed is for body weight, no effect between high and low carbohydrate diets. For hemoglobin A1C, there was a difference, 1 millimole per mole. That was the difference. It was significant, apparently. So nothing in that story. Why is this important? Well, we have a big environmental issue which has been alluded to, and during weight loss, after weight loss, we're going back into that environment, and we're expecting people then to adopt a complete new normality in environment, physical, food environment, their education, the culture, and the social marketing I've mentioned. It's very difficult to teach people to negotiate that environment and to adopt a complete new normality. At the same time, their biology is conspiring to put the weight up by increasing the orexigenic signals, decreasing satiety signals, and by the fall in metabolic rate that we've mentioned. So it's hard. What can we do to help? Well, there are many studies using different interventions. This is a meta-analysis, meta-analysis again. And we were interested in this, that firstly, people who lose weight don't regain it all, whatever they do, particularly those who use very low-calorie diets. And these are dating from before 2007, so they didn't have any particular follow-up afterwards. They didn't regain that weight again, up to 3 years. And we've used this, and several others have now said, hang on, this looks like something we should build on. Henrik Blidel and Christensen in Copenhagen have shown it doesn't matter if you use 400 or 800 calories, what the patients actually do is the same. So don't kid them on, they're going to follow 400 calories, give them something a bit more reasonable. And it doesn't really matter which diet you use. They've explored several. But we're getting much better now at maintaining that weight loss if you use a structured program, perhaps including meal replacements. And we use that, and Roy will mention this, in the direct trial, where we used not a very low calorie diet, an 820 calorie diet. It used a formula diet because our patients preferred that to their homemade diets. It was a total diet exclusion, so that they could lose the weight and think about the future. And they then, it's like Wimbledon. It's like Wimbledon. I'll speed up. They then went on to a weight loss maintenance program. That was the diet they started off on, and then they went on a food-based program. And as you know, the final results showed that, remarkably, with substantial weight loss, they were able to lose 86% of them were no longer diabetic, and in fact, above 10 kilograms weight loss, 73% in remission. I'm not going to talk about the personalized remission, partly because the zeros are here and because it's going to be covered in detail later, or the microbiome, and that's going to be covered elsewhere. So how do we achieve all this? What are we aiming for? Low glycemic load diet seems to me the best bet. You can do that by reducing total carbohydrates, so whoever did that, well done. Or you can choose slow-release, low glycemic index carbohydrates, or you can combine your carbohydrate with other foods, and that could be fats, or it could be amylose-rich carbohydrate, or legumes, importantly legumes. And that takes us right back to the traditional diets that human beings evolved on and what we've done really well. Evolution has been pilloried. There's a set of teeth. Fluoride is important, I won't mention that. I don't think this is the paleo diets as portrayed here is something ever anybody ate to as more teeth. We don't have those teeth, which are dogs and cats, but we have other kinds of teeth. The one in the middle, incidentally, are not ours, they're sheep's. They're more like ours than the others. Neanderthal man was brutal and short, or brutish and short. He was an omnivore. He had a huge capacity for starch digestion, fascinating studies on the fecal remains from Neanderthal man, which are being published at the moment. And he also had intermittent fasting as normal. That was part of normal life. So that's something we can look at. And we have living examples of hunter-gatherer diets now, which are extremely high in carbohydrate with no heart disease or diabetes. What do we need to do? You'll come on to this later on. There are taxing sugar-sweetened beverages, perhaps sweetness, perhaps fats, and Michael Rayner and his colleagues are looking at this now. Acting against misleading marketing, we have failed to enforce existing legislation. We should look at the sponsoring of events, and we should also look at physical activity. The take-home messages are here. You can read them there in the paper. But I think just to draw your attention to one, I think in all this, the science is important, but I think the art has been neglected. And if I'm any good at helping one of my patients, or two of my patients, or a few of them, it's to do with the art. And the best bet, from my mind, is that we should stick with what we were brought up with, and the Mediterranean or Nordic type of diet, or Japanese if you happen to be Japanese. And what I'd like to see in the future is not just more RCDs, but N of 1 crossover trials. BMJ has actually been fundamental in promoting this, but we had none at all. On that happy note, thank you very much.